Library. Today I will be reading Haunted Florida Love Stories by Christopher Balzano. Today's story is Love at the Bridge. Love and hate are not opposites, but rather opposite ends of a single spectrum, different sides of the same coin. They are both born and fueled by passion. To love one thing often leads to the hating of something else, and you can usually trace loathing of something back to a moment when it was loved and fell apart. When paranormal moments happen, the people experiencing it or telling the story of someone else after the fact need to choose which end of the spectrum it comes from. Sometimes the choice is easy. A man was hanged for a crime he didn't commit and comes back to haunt the people who did it to him. A woman loved her favorite piano and is heard playing it long after she is dead. The more confusing and ambiguous the haunting, the harder it is for people to decide which backstory to pick from. This is made nearly impossible when people can't even decide what the meaning of those tales might be. It's said that no one quite knew whether Ludmila Clark committed murder out of love or hate. Perhaps her mental health was a factor. After all, how could someone who did what she did be in their right mind? Even her husband admitted in later years that she had become so obsessed with her actions that she could no longer control herself. The way people tell her story, or at least the way the story has been handed down through the years, paints the picture of a woman who loved children. It was just a shame that she had to kill them. The Peace River runs mostly along Route 17, but there is a stretch that is said to be anything but peaceful. It is connected, even if not physically, to several of the legends in the area, focusing on the power of springs and the potential fountain of youth. In Wakulla, Florida, however, the tales get a little bit darker. It is said that the water there runs blood red under any full moon. The story also goes on to say that on those nights you can hear phantoms splashing and babies cry, and on some occasions see empty buckets on the banks filled with the tainted water. It's all the fault of Ludmila Clark. Although she usually is not named in the story, there have also been references to her being named Mary and Martha. She was a formerly enslaved woman who came south from Georgia shortly after the Civil War and set up shop as a midwife for the growing town of Kula. She was good at her job and well respected for her work in the community, so what she ended up doing was even more confusing to the people of the town. Some say she became obsessed with the overpopulation of the area. After the Civil War, things were tough for everyone in the South, and even more so in Florida, which had a struggling economy and was still reeling from the Seminole Wars when the war between the states broke out. Ludmilla believed it was in everyone's best interest to keep the population down to make the burden easier. Her love for her community led her to do bad things. Some say love motivated her in another way. As a slave, she had seen her own children killed or sold into slavery. After moving to Watula and getting the only job she could, she was forced to deliver other people's children, more specifically, babies born to white families. Looking down at them and knowing she would never hold her own again slowly drove her to mad, and each new child brought her closer to revenge. Either way, the number of stillborn babies she attempted to deliver grew. In reality, Ludmilla had started killing the children, and the more she got away with it, the more careless she became, until the people of the town grew suspicious. The death of a newborn baby was not unusual in those days, and sentimentality for the dead was dulled. Rather than burying the dead children at family or town cemeteries, they allowed her to bury the bodies by the river while she was disposing of the afterbirth. That was why the river started to become red at times, although back then only Ludmilla would see it. Although nothing could ever be proven, whispers spread throughout town. People stopped going to her to deliver their children, causing her to become even more detached from reality. According to her husband, she still made her trips to the same spots, but this time she dumped empty buckets into the water. Try as she could to get it all out, the pails would fill again with bloody water, and the crying voices of the children she had killed drowned out the voice of her husband telling her there was nothing in the water or in the buckets. She became obsessed, traveling to the bridge more and more often and trying to comfort the cries. It became too much. She eventually committed suicide in the water, although other stories say she lost her balance, fell in, and died. A few years later, people walking across the bridge began to hear a wailing coming from the banks of the Peace River. They heard the cries of children and would rush to the water to see what was wrong, only to hear the cries from somewhere else nearby. Even more unexplained, the water in that part of the river would appear red during the full moon, and if you placed an empty bucket near the river's edge, it would fill up with red water. It was around then that people in town renamed the stretch of road they knew as Reinhardt Road to Bloody Bucket Road, and the crude bridge that ran into the main street to Bloody Bucket Bridge. Red flags raise as you hear this story, but it has become one of the most published bits of folklore coming out of that area of Florida. Why was she not killed or at least thrown in jail for her crimes? As she was a black woman living in the South, it would not have been out of the ordinary. Why did it take so long to figure out the story? Why did the people turn her crimes into a tribute? Perhaps the most popular account of the story comes from 2005's Weird Florida by Charlie Carlson. It appears to be the first published version of the legend. He records several witnesses to some of the cries from the woods near Bloody Bucket Bridge on nights of the full moon. Since then, the story has been retold in newspaper articles, websites, and other books, with the details changed slightly but always telling of a woman and her twisted love. The street is now officially known as Griffin Road, the bridge Griffin Road Bridge, and the area that was once her dumping ground is a boat launch into the Peace River. The surrounding bank drops off quickly, with only large stones in the water to balance yourself to get under the bridge. The spot is anything but quiet, with continual traffic, slow but steady, and local animal life, especially alligators and birds. A common ghostly motif is crying at a haunted bridge, much like the story of the Bellamy Bridge in Marianna, Florida. This is a much more romantic version of a ghost story and more well known in the state. There was once a woman named Elizabeth who lost her life near there. She had just married one of the prominent members of Jackson County, Dr. Samuel C. Bellamy. One version of the story speaks of her beginning to dance too wildly at her wedding reception. Another version says she retired to her bedroom to take a nap, and both her dress catches on fire, and she is soon consumed in flames and screaming. Although people rushed to her aid, it was too late, and the burns were too severe. She died a few days later and was buried in the family plot owned by her brother-in-law, Dr. Edward Bellamy, on the banks of Chippewa River. Samuel was devastated by the death of his new bride and would visit her grave often. Eventually, he stopped going, although the pain never truly ended. Perhaps missing him or wanting to comfort him, Elizabeth began to rise from the grave some nights and walk along the banks looking for him. She could be seen on Edward's property and along the water, and when the bridge was eventually built, she was also seen on the bridge getting in the way of cars. Later, other elements of the paranormal were added to the story. Along with the visions came crying heard from near the water. The source of the sound could never be identified. The story has become one of the most popular ghost stories in Florida, with legend trippers and paranormal investigators making their way to that part of the state every year to try to see the woman. The tale, however, is actually a work of fiction based on real people. The couple really did exist and lived in the area. Elizabeth did not die on her wedding night, but years after of disease, probably yellow fever, only a week before her son Alexander passed away from the same sickness. That might be enough grief to cause a ghost, and from multiple reports over the years, you would have to believe the vision and the crying are true. The exaggerated backstory, however, is the work of fiction writer Caroline Lee Hintz, who lived in the area. In her book Ernest Linwood, otherwise known as The Long Moss, there is a story that echoes the folklore events of the Bellamys, although it appears that she got the story from events that happened in Georgia. Hintz claimed that it really happened, and because she often wrote about her adopted home from Marianna, and because the name she used in the story was Bellamy, people eventually embraced the fictional account. There are many natural reasons why something that looks like a person might be seen on a bridge or near a swamp, but the connecting aspect of the Bellamy Bridge and Bloody Bucket Bridge is the sound of someone crying. This repeats itself around the country and around the world. In the paranormal community, it is known as the Crybaby Bridge phenomenon. Scientists believe the sound is not anything spooky or otherworldly, but rather the sound of running water over rock, foundation, or vegetation. People associate it with the human sounds because we are wired to process information against something we know, and every overly alert parent knows that any noise you hear sounds like a kid crying. Most of the first-hand accounts from Bloody Bucket Bridge involve the noises. The rumors of red water, which can't be traced to a source, could be runoff from minerals during certain times of the month. The question remains about why the area, of all the potential spots along the Peace River, gained the fame in its nickname. The police officer who stopped me when we went to check on the legend offered an explanation for the name Bloody Bucket Road. It was one that I had already heard connected to the story and several others like it. The officer said it was a tough bar. Every night there were fights, people being hauled off. People hated to work there because every night when it closed, they had to clean the floors and the wash bucket was filled with all the blood. It was the rough and tumble bar named the Big Apple at the end of the street, now just a slab of concrete overgrown with grass and covered with trucking equipment that gave the street its sinister nickname. The bar was eventually closed and the road went back to being Griffin Road, although few locals still passed around the old name as a reminder of the good old days before the town was dry. By the turn of the 21st century, enough people still remember the nickname to give the stories a ring of truth. Of course, this doesn't account for the midwife or the dead children written about by Carlson and other modern writers. On Halloween 2003, 2 years before Weird Florida was at first published, a blogger known as Cindy circulated a ghost story on the website Country Living, Country Skills, titled The Legend of Bloody Bucket Road. She explains how an old disabled black man sitting outside the 7-Eleven nearby her told the story. She is brought to task in the comments of the story about how many of the physical details of the story are off until she eventually came back and said the story was fiction. She had always heard the name Bloody Bucket Road and wanted to write her own version of how it got its name. The majority of people who gave feedback to her seemed to be fans of her work and understood the legend was made up without being told. But there were enough people who responded to allow the story to take on a life of its own. It's unclear whether Carlson, the man who really solidifies the story in Weird Florida, was working off Cindy's blog or if he was a victim of hearing somebody repeat the story that they had heard from someone else. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us, but everyone I spoke to, including his son, says he was an honest reporter of the unknown and a respected researcher. Elizabeth and Ludmilla, or Mary or Martha if you prefer, are kindred spirits in a way. Part of their stories are oceans apart. One a rich woman who married a doctor, and the other a former enslaved woman driven to mental illness. In death, though, they find a common ground in their sadness and their loneliness. Both loved and lost, and those emotions are strong enough to make their spirits restless. Both continue to linger in our minds when the noises start and reflections make our eyes see things that aren't there. Whether from a place of romance, community well-being, or the love of a child, passion is the fire that flips the coin. Maybe that's why we see both sides of it when something unexplained happens on that bridge down the street. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to look out for more from Swanee River Regional Library in the future.